This is Interstates. I'm Alex Chambers, and I don't know how to be cool. Which is fine. I'm cool with it at this point. I feel like coolness is largely the arena of youth. In my case, I wasn't cool then either. Once, when I was 15, I was hanging out with some friends, and I don't know what prompted it, but one of them told me I was already basically 30. She might have meant it as a dig, but I took it as an observation of basic fact. I took life pretty seriously. Good student, all that. I couldn't figure out how to dress in interesting ways, which at the time I was disappointed by, but also decided to refuse to care about. Jeans and blank t-shirts for me. I've been 30 ever since. Well, at least until I was 40. I think I caught up around then. Now I'm 45. Still don't know how to be cool, but as I said, I'm okay with that. Mostly. I've been thinking about it because a couple weeks ago I talked with someone who is definitely cool. I talked with her because I wanted to understand how punk scenes in the Midwest are distinct from coastal cities. There's some pretty cool theories, but the conversation went beyond geography. So, let me introduce you to Rachel Ann Jolie.
I saw a folk punk show for the first time in at least 15 years. It's so funny because they all, like, crust punk kids and, like, vegan punk kids and anarchist punks, they just dress exactly the same. And there's something so deeply comforting about it. It's the tight, dirty black jeans, the ratty t-shirt. They smell the same. I mean, it was very comforting.
Rachel came up in punk scenes around Cleveland in the 90s and early 2000s. And unlike your host, Rachel figured out cool and still has it. Is it weird for me to do an image search of them? Rachel uses both she and they pronouns, by the way. So I image searched Rachel, and the images I found are published, so it feels okay to talk about them. Here's one from their bio page at the Loft Literary Center. Their hair is in a loose bun just back from the top of their head. Their straight-cut bangs frame a confident but also warm half-smile that brings out their dark, full lipstick. Their shirt is cut just below the shoulders, so you can see a tattoo peeking out on the left. It's a rose with heads of wheat nodding around it. In another image, their hair is down, it's long and black, and they're wearing a black leather jacket over the top. Almost impossible not to look cool in a leather jacket, but Rachel looks like they were born in it. Throughout, Rachel's got style I'll never have. But I'm not trying to rank different looks. Having spoken with Rachel, I feel comfortable saying a big part of their style is about resisting bourgeois norms, not fitting into mainstream society. Which, yes, is pretty much the definition of cool, but let's not forget that bucking the norms comes with its own challenges. Or maybe even comes from having lived with certain challenges. From facing the fact that you're different from what society would really like you to be. Fitting in is easy. Coolness is harder. Rachel Ann Jolie doesn't just wear cool clothes on the internet. She's also a writer, scholar, teacher, and a queer femme who found her people at punk house shows as a teen in the early 2000s. Her memoir, Rust Belt Femme, came out in 2020 and was an NPR favorite book of that year. She's written academic articles and essays and reporting in magazines like Teen Vogue and The Baffler about class, queerness, pop culture, radical social movements, and more. We talked about how the built environment of the Midwest shaped the experience of punk music and house shows. We also talked about the general appeal and complications of coming of age in a punk scene in the early 2000s. That's all coming up after this.
Public radio is radio that matters, and our sustainers keep it going strong year after year. Thank you for your support of WFIU.
Let's set the scene for Rachel's entree into punk. There's a major accident when she's 4 years old. Her dad was taking out the trash and a drunk driver hit him. He was debilitated, and from then on, Rachel and her mom were on their own. They lived in various parts of the outskirts of Cleveland, which are also various outskirts of mainstream society. Her first home was in a rural-ish area, the kind of place that does nothing to challenge stereotypes of the working-class Midwest.
Broken down cars in front lawns cars that didn't work, barns that were falling apart, men in plaid flannel shirts, women in short denim cutoff shorts, big hair, lots of beer cans on front stoops.
They lost the house after her dad's accident, got another one in a place where the neighbors mow their lawns.
Which we didn't get around to doing very often, so we were definitely the black sheep neighbors.
Then they lost that house and ended up in an apartment complex in Parma, Ohio.
Which has a reputation for being sort of like trashy and poor people.
I don't know if you could hear, but they were saying that in scare quotes. They learned a lot of values there that still matter to them. And it wasn't just the values.
As like a queer femme person, I'm okay if with claiming some trashiness, I suppose.
Rachel didn't know it yet, but it's also where they were starting to learn style. Specifically working class femme style, where
femness is often, not always, but often sort of expressed in a slightly more excessive or hyperbolic sort of, sense of femininity. I'm waving around like super long acrylic nails right now in front of the camera. So that like excessiveness was so familiar because I grew up around women, straight identified women, who had big hair, big nails, tattoos, tight clothes. And they were able to do that because they were not going to corporate office jobs where they had to look professional and, polite and buttoned up.
The women she learned femininity from were defying bourgeois decorum. Mostly. There was also her grandmother.
She would take her evening shower and then open her closet and put on these like dramatic outfits to just like go have dinner, sometimes at the dining room table, but also just or on the couch. And she would have these like gold lame pants and sparkly little tank tops, like in through her 60s and 70s. She was just like wearing these little outfits.
So these ideas about femininity were seeping into Rachel's consciousness. Before we're teenagers, we're mostly not aware of our feelings about style. Not that we don't have feelings, but they're less on the surface. And then, of course, adolescence hits, and boom! Being aware of how we're coming across is pretty much the whole experience. That and music.
This feels especially emotional because really the person I have to give the most credit to, or the first credit to, the origin credit to, actually just passed away. It was my best friend's older sister.
She worked at Arabica Coffee House. She hung out with a college boy who made her mixtapes, and she drove Rachel and her friend to school. Rachel remembers the day it happened.
It was like dark in the morning in her Oldsmobile, maybe, is what that car was. Everybody had used cars. And sitting in the back seat, there was this gritty sound that I had never heard, and I had already been into, thanks to alternative radio stations, I had learned about grunge and alternative, and I was like, okay, there's something different than pop music that I'm really feeling drawn to. But then this was like, oh my gosh, this sounds even like weirder than that stuff, and like my body is just like totally electrified by it.
Sitting there in the back seat, Rachel realized
something had changed.
They'd had a feeling, and they wanted to have it again. But how to find it? This music was on a mixtape in her friend's sister's car. Rachel was able to access more music through cars because she had someone willing to drive.
My mom was amazing and would drive us to shows all the time. So I started going to the Agora. And even before I discovered punk and emo and hardcore, she would drive us to like see some, sort of more mainstream alternative bands.
There's a limit to what you can hear at proper venues. Luckily for Rachel, there'd been a recent technological development that would fundamentally change how we relate to each other, our politics, retail stores, music, podcasts. It also allowed Rachel to create her own algorithm.
I would go on AOL profiles and type in bands that I knew and then look at the other bands that people who mentioned that band in their profile talked about. And then I would go on the record websites. So I would go on like Vagrant Records and Equal Vision Records and started learning more about punk and hardcore through like exploring websites. So the internet was part of it, but it was very, very early internet.
But there was still something missing. It's one thing to be a fan at home. It's another to be a part of something. Rachel knew where they wanted to fit in, but they still had to figure out how. That's after the break. At this point, Rachel's listening to punk, and she wants to be living it, breathing it. But
at that point, I still didn't know like real, actual punks. I like knew the music, and I went to my school. I graduated with like 62 kids, I think. So super small school. There was like one punk rock girl who would go to the Warped Tour, who was 2 years older, but she was so mean and like so intimidating. So like I couldn't like be friends with her. So It was me and my best friend whose older sister first introduced us to that music on the mixtape. But that same family, so it was three sisters, my best friend, the oldest sister who just passed away, and then the middle sister. The middle sister worked at Starbucks. And my junior year, right after 9/11, I was learning radical politics on the spot. My family was very liberal, but I was like developing critical thinking skills as the U.S. was beating this patriotic, sort of war machine drum, and starting to sort of say this stuff out loud. And my friend Amanda was working with this super radical punk rock barista, and she was like, "You guys sound just like each other. You should talk." And I was just, shaking in my Converse sneakers, so excited to talk to this cute boy who had like way smarter things to say and was ultimately too old for me. But he was really my pathway. Shout out, I'll give him a shout out. I mean, he was kind of a jerky 20-year-old guy back then, but he opened the door because he was part of actual punk scenes in Lakewood, Ohio, which had tons of house venues. There was a DIY space called Speak in Tongues that he went to all the time. And so we started basically talking about the war, and then that led to talking about music. And then we kind of half dated for a little bit, but really what he gave me was the gift of so many more bands and took me to some of these venues. Another house called Fort Totally Awesome. The Tower was a space that existed right before I left for college. So yeah, my last 2 years of high school, I found subculture. I became part of subculture.
Do you remember your first house show?
It was probably a super loud, scary, hardcore band in the basement of Fort Totally Awesome. But the more prominent memory is when, I'm guessing a lot of folks know the band Against Me. They became very popular, and they played, and they were already becoming a little bit bigger. So it was the most packed, this duplex, or it wasn't even a duplex. It was just a proper sort of old Midwest house in Lakewood, Ohio. And they had never had that many people in the space, and the floor almost started to did start to cave in, and people had to leave because there were so many people there. So I got to see Against Me play in a living room, which was pretty cool.
Success. If only it were so simple. At first, Rachel wasn't thinking too hard about how white the scene was or how macho.
I was a punk before I was a feminist, so I had to sort of learn all that in reverse. There were a lot of girlfriends of the boys who would go to those spaces because of their boyfriends. And I think many of us also were equally obsessed with the music and wanted to be there. But looking back, yeah, sometimes I'm it's a bummer that was often the ticket in.
The spaces were complex. People were playing with gender.
The punk rock barista boyfriend who introduced me to all of punk, he worked at the Gap, and he would buy women's jeans because they were tight, and that was very much the style, tight black jeans or tight dark blue jeans. And he would get the boys at my high school. He did not come around often because he was, again, too old for me. And he came to one school concert, and it was basically the beginning of our breakup, because it was I'm still in high school and you shouldn't be at this high school. But he showed up, and I went to school with football players, basically. And I just got teased all the time because my boyfriend wore girls' jeans. But I was you guys have no idea how he is so cool in my punk scenes.
But it didn't mean they were feminists either.
Just because they dressed in girls' pants doesn't mean they couldn't still be jerks. Just to make that clear.
If being someone's girlfriend was the ticket in, it was also a sign the space wasn't as safe as it should have been.
I think I'm also realizing how I witnessed very early stages of what I would not call call-out culture, but sort of more that, the sort of militant feminist gossip networks of stay away from that guy. That kind of stuff was very, I would give a lot of credit to feminist punks because there was a lot of trying to keep people safe.
This was all happening at places like the Tower and Fort Totally Awesome. These were not official venues. They were DIY, house venues. And in case it didn't already matter that this was in the Midwest, although it did because of all the driving, listening to mixtapes, sharing music with friends, all that car time, the Midwest matters in relation to houses too. Those house venues were not in Cleveland proper. They were in the suburb of Lakewood. There were other ways, too, that Lakewood was not Cleveland proper.
It was the Gayborhood. It was called the Gayborhood when I was growing up. So there was already a little bit of that alternative culture because being gay in the 90s was like very alternative, not corporate Target, Pride merch.
Lakewood was residential and also edgy. Gay bars, witchy stores with crystals and incense.
Vintage stores, I remember just seeing a store with big goth boots, sort of I was like, oh, this looks like Hot Topic, but for real. I started to understand. I was like, oh, wait, Hot Topic might be for posers.
And Lakewood was affordable. Houses in Lakewood were affordable, even for people in their late teens and early 20s. And that made the experience of going to punk shows different than in cities.
The scene that I was a part of was largely people in their late teens and early 20s who weren't in college. That it was not a super college-y scene. So it was a pretty working class punk scene.
It wasn't just about the houses. There's a lot more space in the Midwest. A lot more space to roll around in, wondering what to do. Space to make something happen. And the motivation.
On the coasts, there's this sort of semblance that you have so many options of places to go and things to do. Whereas in the Midwest, in these smaller cities and smaller towns and communities, it's we have no choices. We have to build this, and it has to be really awesome. I think that's real. I mean, I think I felt that, having lived mostly in Midwest cities, but then also a little bit on the East Coast. And just knowing what I know from California, how far away everything is, there's just something I do think about the geography, the closeness, the smallness, and the feeling of desperation because we don't have a lot of cool stuff to do that allows some of that to flourish, maybe.
It's so interesting because when I think of sort of the stereotypical Midwest teenager experience and this kind of small town thing, I think of driving around and hanging out in a Walmart parking lot or something like that. I hadn't really thought about how it also can create this DIY house scene, which is actually really cool.
Well, yeah, for sure. But it's both. Those scenes are not so separate. Literally, I went to Walmart after a show once, or it might have been, it wasn't Walmart because we were really on our high horses about not going to Walmart because of the politics of it all. It was Kmart, I think, so much better. But to buy Dickies pants because he just thought they were really cool, and he's you can get them really cheap, at the Kmart or whatever. So we went there super late at night, I remember. And then also I remember, man, the punks loved Taco Bell. And there's still this Taco Bell in Cleveland does punk shows in the parking lot sometimes. So there was a real still the same imagery that you have of the Walmarts and the chain fast food restaurants. That was also part of it.
Well, I think with Taco Bell was the one fast food place where you could get something vegan.
Vegan,
right?
Exactly. That's what it was. Yeah.
Yeah,
yep.
Exactly. I mean, I'm thinking too, just with Kmart, it was okay because Kmart was already probably on the decline. So
totally.
this sort of nostalgia thing for it already, I'm sure.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
So did the house scene, the fact that it was a house scene, shape the ways that people interacted with the space, the space in the house, with each other?
I mean, I think definitely just the fact that there was a kitchen with food felt like it created... I don't want to romanticize it too much because the spaces were, especially for me being a young girl, really girl at the time, starting out going there when I was 17, intimidating. They were very intimidating spaces. And so I don't want to romanticize this, but still what I gathered from the people who looked more comfortable there is that being able to just sit around and eat and talk, it expanded the DIY-ness of it all. It was and we'll bring our own food and beer, whatever. It was so much, there wasn't money. I mean, I really don't remember ever paying for a show. I think the bands would just like pass a hat for travel. So that made a difference when you're not getting your hand stamped or getting charged. Like those formalities remove some of that intimacy inevitably, even at super small venues. And so to just like walk in somebody's house and like go to the kitchen and get some food, and there's real intimacy in that.
But finding your place, whether it's in the Kmart parking lot or the Taco Bell or the combination, it's not just about the location. It can be hard to see the comforts of middle-class life in the world around you, or the ease of fitting in as a man or woman without having to think about it, and not want a subculture. It can be hard, but if you're lucky, you do find that culture. You do find a place and people that see you, that accept all the prickly, uncomfortable ways you don't fit in with how the world says you're supposed to be. As much as punk looks and sounds like cool, what Rachel knew, I think from the beginning, was that it was a lot deeper than the clothes.
When you don't fit in to mainstream society, there's so much community to find on the outskirts of it.
That's what punk gave them. Rachel and the kids she hung out with. And the crust punk kids today, too. So yes, punk is cool. But not just badass cool. Also, for the people who find it, it's just kind of a cool place to be. And that's our show. We'd love to hear what it made you think about. Send us an email or a voice memo through the contact tab on our website, wfiu.org/interstates, or get in touch on Facebook or Instagram. All right, we're at the moment when I've been asking you to rate and review the show on your favorite podcast app. Honestly, I don't know how much that really helps. What's probably more effective, if you like the show, is telling a friend about it. Maybe you could tell them when something important is going on so they'll remember it later. Like that time your golden retriever ran out the dog door in a panic during a thunderstorm, but instead of just hiding under the trampoline in terror, then bouncing back in, tail happily wagging because he did once again survive, he didn't come back until the next morning. Tail wagging, of course, because of who he is. And then the next night he ran out again and didn't come back till morning. And it became a pattern. So one night you and your good friend sat by the window to watch where he went, and this young woman in ripped jeans was at the end of the sidewalk, luring him out with a treat. And the two of you ran out, but she was already gone with the dog. So you waited and waited, dozing off, until your friend heard a car door open, and she managed to get out there just in time to wedge her foot in the door after your dog jumped out. And she said, "What are you doing? Why do you keep kidnapping my friend's dog?" And the young woman looked a little sad and apologized and said,
"You guys have no idea, like, how he is so cool in my punk scenes."
And that sounded like something you'd heard on your favorite podcast. So you told your friend to give it a listen. Like that. Okay, we've got your quick moment of slow radio coming up. But first, the credits. Thanks, as always, to the Interstates Brain Trust for crucial editorial guidance. That's Jillian Blackburn, Dom Hyab, and Natalie Ingalls. Interstates is produced and edited by me, Alex Chambers. Our associate producers are Dom Hyab and Carl Templeton. Our master of social media is Jillian Blackburn. We get support from Eobon Binder, Luann Johnson, Sam Schemenauer, Peyton Whaley, Lisa Robin Young, and Kate Young. Our executive producer is Eric Bolstridge. Our theme song is by Amy Olsner and Justin Vollmer, and we have additional music from the artists at Universal Production Music. All right, time for some found sound. That was the Toden Arakawa line in Tokyo, recorded by Carl Pearson. Thanks, Carl. Until next week, I'm Alex Chambers. Thanks for listening.
Riding back at the top of the hunter's moon. See airplanes like stars slinging. make the rounds and soon